All right, you need to pull out the copy of paper that looks like this. It's a partially completed Venn diagram. We are going to be completing this Venn diagram over two forms of reproduction. So far, we've talked about cellular reproduction, and that falls into one of two categories, either meiosis, if you're producing more gametes, or mitosis, when you're producing more somatic cells. Just a reminder, somatic cells are all of the cells in your body, whether it's muscle cells, bone cells, skin cells, all of those are going to be mitosis. And so today we're going to zoom out a little bit from that. We're going to look at reproduction on the level of the organism. And so we're going to look at how organisms reproduce. And there are two main categories that organisms use. They either reproduce through sexual reproduction. Let me switch to my pencil here. So they either sexually reproduce or reproduce asexually. So just fill your notes out with me as I go. Both of these are going to be similar in that they carry out the task of reproduction. And what is reproduction? It's just producing offspring, producing more of whatever that type of organism that you're referring to. Okay, we are going to start over here on the left side with sexual reproduction. This is going to be used in all animals, especially all mammals. You're going to use sexual reproduction. And within this category, you're going to need two parents. And that's because half of your DNA is going to come from the father, and half of the DNA is going to come from the mother. And these two halves of DNA, they combine from each parent in the combination of a sperm and an egg cell, and they result in a unique offspring. How are they unique? Well, you'll remember that there are lots of things that go into the production of a gamete, one of which being the crossing over, second of which you're getting the DNA from two different parents. And so both of those factors, crossing over and getting DNA from two different sorts, is going to result in that uniqueness to the offspring. So you're going to notice that offspring are similar to their parents, but they're not going to be exactly the same. So you might think about you and your siblings, or one of your friends and their siblings. They're similar, they might all look similar, but they're not going to be identical. And like we just talked about, a lot of this is due to the crossing over that happens in meiosis. So meiosis makes sexual reproduction possible. And because of that crossing over, we are going to notice great genetic variation in our offspring. I'm going to move over to the other side. We're going to talk about asexual reproduction. Let me see if I can, there we go, move that out of the way. In the word asexual, that A prefix is just going to mean not. So this is the opposite. This is not sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, you are only going to have one parent. Because you only have one parent, because you don't have meiosis in asexual reproduction, your DNA in all of your offspring that are produced through asexual reproduction are going to be identical to their parents. And so when we think about our types of cellular reproduction, we have two options. We have meiosis or mitosis. Meiosis is going to result in unique offspring. And so the only type of cellular reproduction that's available to use in asexual reproduction is going to be mitosis. We know that mitosis results in offspring that are identical to each other. It results in identical daughter cells. And so in asexual reproduction, there's going to be no genetic variation among offspring because of this. They are all going to have the same genes, the same traits as their parents did. And so you might think that this is a lot less common. We're very used to animals and larger organisms and how they function. But there are lots of smaller organisms that are going to use asexual reproduction. And so one example is going to be bacteria. Bacteria use a type of asexual reproduction called binary fission. So looking at this, binary just means two, and fission means breaking apart. So we'll go over here, we'll look at an example of this. So this is going to show an amoeba. Amoebas are going to be very similar to bacteria. They're single-celled organisms, and you're always going to start with one parent, whether it's an amoeba or a bacteria. And then as we go through this chart, we see a lot of similarities to the process of mitosis. You see your genetic material here in the middle. It starts by duplicating, and then it elongates and it separates into two separate nuclei. And then finally, you get your cytokinesis, and those two cells are free to move away from each other. These two daughter cells are going to be identical to each other, because this was a mitotic process that happened, and because there was no recombination of DNA between two parents. Both of these daughters inherited their DNA from the parent, the single parent. That parent could only pass on the DNA that they had, and thus there is no genetic variation within our daughter cells. We'll go back to our Venn diagram. We're going to go over a couple more examples of asexual reproduction. Okay, another very common type that you'll see is budding. Okay, for this we're going to take the example of yeast. We'll go over to our yeast picture. So we'll see here, we start with a single yeast cell. That yeast is going to double its genetic information, and some of its genetic information is going to come up here and separate out. And then you'll see that the membrane starts to close and starts to separate off that new bud, that new yeast organism. It has its own DNA, even though it's identical to the DNA in the original parent yeast cell. So that DNA is still identical. But what's different about budding from binary fission and makes it a little bit more different from mitosis is that it stays connected. So you'll notice when you have budding, it looks like you have a big chain of cells that are all connected to each other. And that's exactly how they describe it. It's a chain of buds when you have this type of asexual reproduction. But you still start with the one parent. That one parent has to pass their DNA onto every single one of their offsprings, and there is no genetic variation in that either. We'll go back to our Venn diagram, and we'll move on to our last example. Finally, we're going to talk about runners. And if you do much gardening, this is going to be the one that you're probably the most familiar with. So for our example, we're going to look at strawberries. Spider plants work very similarly though, and there are lots of other plants that reproduce by runners. So if you look at this diagram, you'll notice we have one big strawberry plant right here. I'll call this the parent because it's bigger, because it's producing fruit, and it's probably been around longer. that parent has its own set of root system. It has its own set of leaves, and it is self-sufficient, so it can make its own energy. Okay, it makes its own energy. But what we notice over here is there's this runner that forms. So this runner comes out, it grows out from the parent, and then it establishes itself by developing a root system and leaves. Now it can make its own energy too. It is no longer at this point dependent on the parent plant, because if we cut this runner, this new plant, this offspring, would be able to continue making its own energy. However, it came from the parent plant. And so, because it came from the parent plant, all of these cells along the runner were produced through mitosis. This entire plant from this point on, the roots and the leaves were produced through mitosis. And so the DNA of the parent is going to be identical to the DNA of the offspring strawberry plant. Most of the time, these runners will end up going very close to the ground or below ground. So you might look at a strawberry plant and not notice them at first. One other example of this would be spider plants. We have one in our classroom on the back wall that you can look at the next time you get the chance. Spider plants use the same runner system to reproduce, except spider plants come from the top of the plant. They're a little bit more visible. So if you ask me, I can point those out to you the next time we're in the classroom. I'm going to zoom out on this Venn diagram in case you need to fill anything else out. You can pause the video here. Please ask me if you have any questions about these two types of reproduction. And then when you're finished filling out this Venn diagram, it needs to go in the section of your binder with the rest of your notes.